I am Nathaniel Brooks, 34 years old, a senior systems engineer living in Richmond, Virginia, and for 5 years I have been married to Lauren Brooks, who is 32 and works as an HR coordinator at Harbor Access Solutions, a mid-sized logistics company that prides itself on corporate culture and team-building seminars. On the surface, we looked stable, predictable, the kind of couple that hosted quiet dinners and filed taxes early. But that Thursday night, at exactly 8:10 p.m., something subtle shifted in a way I did not fully grasp until later. Lauren walked through the front door after her weekly wine meetup with Vanessa, Chloe, and Brianna, all recently divorced, and all suddenly very vocal about self-fulfillment and personal rediscovery. And the first thing I noticed was not what she said, but how she said it. Her tone carried a rehearsed steadiness, like someone who had practiced lines in the mirror before stepping onto a stage. She set her purse down carefully, not casually, and stood in the kitchen doorway while I was rinsing a plate. Her posture was straight, chin slightly lifted, eyes locked on me in a way that suggested she expected a reaction before she even delivered the news. She told me she felt invisible in our marriage, that lately she had been questioning whether I truly saw her, and then she introduced the real point of her speech. There was a new marketing associate at Harbor Access Solutions named Caleb Turner who, according to her, noticed the details about her, complimented her ideas in meetings, laughed at her jokes, and made her feel appreciated in a way she claimed she had not felt in years. She did not outright confess to anything physical, but the implication hung in the air heavy and deliberate. She said she felt like she might have options. I could almost see the invisible script in her head, the expectation that I would drop the plate, demand answers, accuse her of emotional cheating, maybe even beg her to reconsider. There was a pause after she finished speaking, a carefully constructed silence meant to give me space to unravel. Instead, I dried my hand slowly, leaned against the counter, and told her calmly that if she truly believed exploring those options was what she needed, I would not stand in her way. I kept my voice level, steady, almost clinical. I did not accuse, I did not plead, I did not raise my tone. I simply acknowledged her autonomy and removed myself from the emotional battlefield she had prepared. The look on her face was immediate and unmistakable. Her confidence flickered. The certainty that had colored her posture dissolved into something closer to confusion. She blinked twice as if she had misheard me. She asked if that was all I had to say. I told her I respected her honesty and that I was not interested in forcing someone to stay where they felt unseen. The silence that followed was different from the first one. It was not charged with anticipation anymore. It was hollow. For 5 years I had been the stable one, the reliable one, the husband who fixed things and optimized systems. And in that moment I realized she had expected me to react like a malfunctioning machine. Instead, I responded like an engineer assessing a variable. I did not chase her. I did not compete with Caleb Turner. I did not ask who else knew. I simply returned to the living room and turned the television back on, not out of indifference, but out of clarity. The power dynamic that had quietly tilted toward her that evening shifted back the second I refused to perform the role she had assigned me. I saw it in the way she lingered in the doorway, waiting for a crack in my composure that never came. The next morning the atmosphere in our house felt staged, like the aftermath of a scene that had not landed the way the lead actress expected. And I noticed the difference immediately when Lauren stepped out of the bedroom dressed with a precision that bordered on calculated. She had chosen a fitted navy dress instead of her usual slacks, her hair styled in loose waves that required more than her typical 10-minute routine, and she wore a perfume I had not smelled in months, one she usually reserved for company parties or weddings. She lingered near the kitchen island while I was already seated with my laptop open, reviewing a block of deployment scripts for a client migration scheduled that afternoon, and she cleared her throat in a way that suggested she wanted an audience. She announced that Caleb had invited her to lunch at a trendy rooftop spot downtown called Skyline Terrace, describing it as the kind of place with glass railings and craft cocktails and a panoramic view of Richmond's skyline, the sort of detail that was unnecessary unless it was meant to provoke comparison. She added that he had gone out of his way to reserve a table despite the short notice, and she emphasized how thoughtful that was given how busy he claimed to be. While she applied a final touch of lipstick using the reflection of her phone screen, she continued explaining how attentive he had been during their last meeting at Harbor Access Solutions, how he complimented her presentation skills during a marketing review, how he said she brought a calm authority to the room that others lacked. Each detail was delivered slowly, almost experimentally, as if she were dropping breadcrumbs and waiting to see which one would make me flinch. I did not flinch. I looked up briefly from my code, met her eyes with a neutral expression, and told her that Skyline Terrace sounded nice and that I hoped she enjoyed her lunch. My voice carried no sarcasm, no edge, no visible insecurity. I returned to my screen and resumed typing, adjusting a configuration file, and testing an automation patch that had been giving me inconsistent results. The quiet clicking of my keyboard filled the space where she clearly expected confrontation. She stood there a few seconds longer than necessary, perhaps waiting for a delayed reaction, and when none came, she grabbed her purse with more force than required and walked out the door. Throughout the morning, she sent a couple of texts describing the view from the rooftop and how Caleb had insisted on paying, how he was such a good listener, and how refreshing it felt to be appreciated. I responded each time with simple, measured replies, telling her that it sounded pleasant and that I hope her afternoon went smoothly. I did not interrogate her. I did not question his intentions. I did not attempt to reassert dominance or stake a claim. With every neutral response, I could sense her growing frustration, even through the screen. She wanted me to fight, to demand exclusivity, to display jealousy as proof that she still mattered enough to unsettle me. What she did not realize was that her performance had already forced something far more significant inside me than anger. While she was attempting to provoke an emotional reaction, I was quietly re-evaluating the architecture of our marriage. I began replaying the last few years in my head, noticing patterns I had previously ignored. I had leaned into stability, into being dependable and consistent, believing that predictability equaled security. I had focused on career growth, financial planning, optimizing our routines, ensuring the mortgage was paid and the retirement accounts were healthy. In doing so, I had slowly reduced myself to a function rather than a partner. At the same time, she had been seeking reassurance in subtle ways, looking for affirmation, for spontaneous validation, for something less structured than the life I had built. Her attempt to spark jealousy did not ignite panic in me, because somewhere along the line we had both drifted into emotional autopilot. The truth that settled in my chest was not rage, but recognition. We were not standing on the edge of an affair. We were standing in the middle of detachment that had been growing quietly for years. Her frustration that morning was not about Caleb. It was about the fact that my refusal to perform exposed a distance between us, and that exposure was far more unsettling than any argument would have been. That same week, after days of controlled conversations and deliberate emotional distance at home, I reached out to someone who represented a very different chapter of my life, Dr. Allison Harper, 35 years old, someone I had met during graduate school seminars on network infrastructure resilience, back when my ambitions were still sharp and unburdened by routine. Allison was now based in Alexandria, Virginia, and had built Harper Strategic Cyber from the ground up into a serious force in the cybersecurity sector, recently securing federal defense contracts worth millions, the kind of achievement that required not only technical mastery, but strategic aggression and relentless confidence. I sent her a brief message suggesting we catch up while she was in Richmond for meetings, and she responded with a concise confirmation and a proposed location, a cafe called Ironwood Social that blended exposed brick with polished steel, the kind of place that attracted consultants, founders, and people who measure time in billable hours. When I arrived Friday evening, she was already there, seated near the window with a tablet open and a coffee untouched, her posture upright, her attention undivided when she looked up and recognized me. There was no theatrical surprise, no layered subtext, just a firm handshake and a direct smile that conveyed competence rather than flirtation. She had the presence of someone who had negotiated contracts in boardrooms, filled with people twice her age, and left with terms in her favor. We ordered drinks and sat across from each other, and within minutes the conversation moved past pleasantries into substance. She spoke about scaling Harper Strategic Cyber, about hiring analysts who could handle federal compliance frameworks without cutting corners, about the weight of leading teams that depended on her clarity under pressure. Her voice carried conviction without the need for embellishment. What struck me most was how openly she discussed partnership, not in a romanticized sense, but in practical terms. She described how she evaluated collaborators based on competence, reliability, and long-term vision, explaining that in both business and life, she had no interest in power plays or emotional manipulation. She valued ambition that was earned, not performed. There were no subtle tests in her questions, no pauses designed to provoke insecurity. When she asked about my work as a senior systems engineer in Richmond, she listened carefully to my explanation of distributed systems architecture and enterprise automation strategies, responding with informed observations that made it clear she understood the technical depth rather than simply nodding politely. The exchange felt efficient yet natural, intellectually stimulating without being adversarial. For 2 hours the conversation flowed without friction. We discussed cybersecurity threats evolving alongside artificial intelligence, the bureaucratic complexities of federal contracts, the balance between growth and sustainability. She mentioned the discipline required to protect what she was building, the necessity of aligning with people who enhanced rather than drained momentum. I realized I was speaking more openly than I had in months, describing not just tasks and projects, but the strategic decisions behind them. There was no tension beneath the surface, no attempt to trigger a reaction, no performance. It was an interaction grounded in mutual respect for skill and drive. When we finally stood to leave, there was no dramatic conclusion, just a measured acknowledgement of the value of the conversation and a mutual understanding that time had been well spent. As I stepped out into the cool Virginia evening and walked toward my car, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The atmosphere I was heading back to carried unspoken challenges and carefully crafted provocations, while the interaction I had just experienced was straightforward, built on clarity and competence. Driving home, I found myself replaying not flirtation or fantasy, but the simple ease of being engaged without being tested. The difference was not about attraction alone, but about alignment, and that realization lingered with me long after the cafe lights faded in the rearview mirror. Over the next several days, Lauren intensified what had clearly become a calculated campaign, layering detail upon detail about Caleb, as if she were constructing a narrative designed to corner me into an emotional response. One evening, she mentioned that he had paid for her drinks during a happy hour at the Foundry Bar, emphasizing the gesture as though generosity itself were proof of superior value. She described the ambient lighting, the exposed beams, the way he leaned in when she spoke, and she made sure to add that he had texted her goodnight afterward, calling her amazing and telling her he admired how she carried herself at Harbor Access Solutions. Each time she delivered these updates, she studied my face carefully, her eyes scanning for micro-expressions, for tightening in my jaw, for the flicker of insecurity she seemed convinced would surface. I gave her nothing. I listened, nodded once or twice, and returned to whatever I had been doing, whether reviewing system logs or refining a deployment timeline. I did not rush to defend my position. I did not counter with accusations. I did not compete. The more composed I remained, the more deliberate her disclosures became. It was as if she believed increasing the dosage would eventually produce the reaction she wanted. Instead, her escalation only reinforced the distance between us. I was no longer reacting to her words emotionally. I was observing them analytically, recognizing the strategy behind them. During that same period, Allison reached out with an invitation to a defense industry networking mixer at the Dominion Club in Arlington, an event attended by contractors, consultants, and federal procurement officials. The setting alone contrasted sharply with the charged atmosphere in my living room. The Dominion Club carried a quiet confidence, manicured grounds, and understated elegance that signaled influence without shouting it. When I arrived, Allison introduced me to several executives from firms specializing in cybersecurity compliance and threat assessment. There was no pretense in her tone when she described my background. She spoke about my technical leadership, my experience with enterprise systems, my ability to design resilient infrastructure under pressure. She did so matter-of-factly, without embellishment, yet with a certainty that made others listen. At one point, she brought me into a conversation with a Department of Defense procurement director who mentioned an open senior evaluation role tied to infrastructure oversight contracts, starting at $165,000 annually plus performance-based bonuses. The figure was stated plainly, without theatrics, yet it carried weight. The director asked about my experience with large-scale systems audits and compliance mapping, and I responded with specifics, outlining methodologies and risk mitigation frameworks I had implemented. The exchange felt substantive. There were no hidden motives, no attempts to provoke insecurity, no emotional chess moves. It was a professional discussion rooted in capability and value. Allison stood beside me during that conversation, reinforcing key points about my track record with calm assurance. She did not inflate my credentials, but she highlighted them unapologetically. For the first time in years, I felt recognized not for stability alone, but for competence and ambition. The respect in that room was transactional in the healthiest sense, built on what I could contribute rather than how I might react. Driving back from Arlington that night, I felt a clarity that had been missing for a long time. At home, I was being tested, measured for jealousy and desperation. At the Dominion Club, I was evaluated for skill and potential. The contrast was undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely respected, not provoked, not manipulated, but acknowledged for the substance I brought into a room. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a way that felt almost cinematic in its timing, the kind of coincidence that would have seemed contrived if I had not lived it myself. Allison had invited me to join her for a late lunch meeting at the Dominion Club because she was finalizing introductions for a consulting initiative tied to federal compliance assessments, and I had adjusted my schedule to meet her there. We were seated near the glass facade, overlooking the city, sunlight cutting across the polished table, while we reviewed notes and exchanged ideas about scalable evaluation frameworks. At one point she laughed at something I said about legacy system migrations. Not a forced polite laugh, but a genuine one, and I felt relaxed in a way that had become rare for me. What I did not know at the time was that Lauren was attending an HR leadership seminar at the same venue that day. During one of her breaks, she apparently walked past the exterior corridor that ran alongside the glass facade and saw us seated there, leaning slightly toward each other in conversation. My posture open, my expression unguarded. She later described how she froze mid-step, recognizing me instantly, and how the image did not align with the version of events she believed she was orchestrating at home that night. When she walked through the door, the energy was entirely different from the rehearsed confidence of previous evenings. There was tension in her shoulders, a tightness in her jaw. She did not wait long before confronting me, asking in a controlled but brittle tone whether Allison was just networking. The phrasing itself carried accusation, wrapped in restraint. I set my laptop aside and looked at her calmly, reminding her that she had explicitly stated she felt she had options and that I had respected her autonomy to explore them. I told her that professional networking was part of my world and that I had no intention of hiding it. For the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. It was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of doubt replacing the steady confidence she had worn like armor. She pressed further, asking how long I had known Allison, what her role was, what exactly we discussed. I answered factually, without embellishment, describing her as a cybersecurity entrepreneur based in Alexandria who had built Harper Strategic Cyber into a company with federal defense contracts. I watched the information register in real time. Later that evening, I noticed her on her phone longer than usual, her brow furrowed, fingers moving quickly across the screen. She was researching Allison. Within minutes, she would have found articles about Harper Strategic Cyber's rapid growth, coverage of federal partnerships, interviews discussing large-scale contracts and compliance leadership. Allison's professional footprint was not subtle. It was documented, measurable, and substantial. The narrative Lauren had constructed about attention and validation suddenly collided with something far less controllable. The shift in her demeanor was not explosive. It was quieter than that. The certainty that she could provoke jealousy without consequence began to erode. For weeks, she had operated under the assumption that she was managing the emotional tempo of our marriage, introducing Caleb Turner as leverage, measuring my reactions like data points. Now the dynamic felt less predictable. Her game no longer appeared contained within the boundaries she had defined. The confidence she had carried since that Thursday night cracked just enough for me to see the vulnerability underneath. And in that fracture, I sensed that the control she believed she held was slipping beyond her grasp. That weekend, the atmosphere in the house shifted again, but this time it was softer, almost cautious, as if Lauren had realized that escalation was no longer producing the outcome she expected. On Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of lemon zest and warm ricotta drifting through the hallway, a scent I had not experienced in years because lemon ricotta pancakes were something she used to make early in our marriage when effort felt effortless. I walked into the kitchen to find her standing at the stove in leggings and an oversized sweater, hair loosely tied back, sunlight catching the edge of the skillet. The presentation was intentional, but no longer confrontational. It felt like a retreat rather than an advance. She greeted me with a tentative smile and said she thought we could spend the day reconnecting, maybe take a walk along the river, maybe watch a movie in the afternoon, just the two of us without distractions. Her tone was stripped of the sharp edges that had defined the previous weeks. Over breakfast, she admitted that Vanessa, Chloe, and Brianna had been filling her head with narratives about reclaiming power and testing loyalty, about how men only value what they fear losing. She said she might have let their stories influence her thinking more than she realized. There was vulnerability in her voice now, but it was tangled with something else, something closer to anxiety. I listened carefully, not interrupting, then asked her directly whether what she truly wanted was partnership or reassurance. I kept my voice calm and steady, not accusatory, not defensive. I told her those were not the same thing. Partnership required alignment, shared ambition, mutual respect. Reassurance was about soothing fear. She tried to answer, but her words circled back to the same place every time. She spoke about how the idea of losing me suddenly felt real, how seeing me at the Dominion Club laughing with Allison unsettled her in a way she had not anticipated. She did not articulate a vision of rebuilding something stronger. She articulated fear. When she finally asked me to stop seeing Allison, the request came out more fragile than forceful. She said it made her uncomfortable, that it crossed a line. I reminded her calmly that for 2 weeks she had openly entertained another man, narrating every compliment, every paid drink, every goodnight text, as though they were strategic moves. I told her that her exploration had been theatrical, constructed to provoke a reaction. Mine, however, had not been about performance. It had forced me to confront who I was, what I valued, and how I wanted to be regarded in both my career and my marriage. It had become transformative rather than reactive. She stared at me in silence after that, and for the first time since this began I saw a genuine fear in her expression. Not fear of competition, but fear of losing control of a narrative she believed she could manage. The difference between us in that moment was stark. She had wanted to test the foundation. I had evaluated it. She had sought reassurance that I would fight. I had discovered that I no longer needed to fight to know my worth. That distinction unsettled her more than jealousy ever could have, because it meant the dynamic she thought she was steering was no longer in her hands. The confrontation reached its inevitable peak on a quiet Wednesday evening, when Lauren stood in the middle of the living room with her arms crossed and demanded that I choose immediately between her and Allison. As though compressing the situation into a single ultimatum would restore the control she felt slipping away. Her voice carried a mixture of anger and desperation. The composure she once relied on replaced by urgency. She said she could not continue living in uncertainty and that I needed to prove where my loyalty stood. The demand was not framed as a conversation about rebuilding trust or redefining expectations. It was framed as a binary decision designed to force a visible declaration. I remained seated, hands folded loosely, and told her that I was choosing something different entirely. I explained that I was choosing not to remain in a marriage built on emotional tests, provocation, and calculated jealousy. I told her that the moment our relationship shifted from partnership to performance was the moment it began to fracture beyond simple repair. I spoke without raising my voice, without dramatic gestures, because the decision had already crystallized inside me days earlier. The clarity I felt was not impulsive. It was deliberate and steady. I informed her that I had already accepted the defense contractor position connected to the Department of Defense Procurement Office and had formally submitted my notice at my old firm. The offer of $165,000 annually plus bonuses represented more than a salary increase. It represented alignment with ambition and an environment where competence was valued directly. I had signed the documents earlier that week, understanding fully that the transition would require relocation closer to Arlington. I did not present it as retaliation. I presented it as progression. Lauren accused me of abandoning our history, of discarding 5 years as though they were disposable. Her voice trembled as she listed milestones: our first apartment, the vacations, the shared holidays, the nights we stayed up planning our future. I listened carefully before responding that history, while meaningful, does not obligate future unhappiness. I told her that shared memories do not justify continuing in a dynamic that relies on insecurity to validate commitment. I reminded her that when she introduced the idea of options, she altered the foundation of the marriage. I simply evaluated the new reality honestly. The days that followed were tense, but subdued, the volatility replaced by logistical discussions. Within a month, I secured a condominium closer to my new office in Arlington, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a short commute that aligned with the new pace of my professional life. Packing the house in Richmond felt less dramatic than I expected. There were no explosive arguments, only a quiet recognition that the structure we had built no longer served either of us. Divorce proceedings began shortly after, handled with the same measured tone that had defined the final weeks. There were documents to sign, assets to divide, timelines to establish. The emotional turbulence that once defined our conversations had given way to formal closure. I did not feel triumph. I felt resolution. The confrontation that demanded a choice had clarified what I had already understood. I was not choosing between two women. I was choosing between stagnation and alignment, between reacting to tests and living deliberately. Once that distinction became undeniable, the path forward required no further negotiation. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized in a courthouse conference room that felt more administrative than emotional, a quiet conclusion to what had once been a carefully curated life. The paperwork was processed efficiently, signatures exchanged without hostility, and the final decree arrived by email 2 days later. There was no dramatic closure, no last-minute pleas, only the formal acknowledgement that our marriage had ended. Lauren moved into a smaller apartment on the outskirts of Richmond, a modest place that suited a single income and a quieter routine. Over time, she stopped speaking to Vanessa, Chloe, and Brianna, the friends who had encouraged her strategy of testing loyalty through manufactured scarcity. I did not learn this through confrontation or gossip, but through the gradual thinning of mutual social connections and the absence of their names in conversations we once shared. Caleb transferred to another branch of Harbor Access Solutions not long after the divorce proceedings began, a detail I heard through a former colleague. Whatever spark or intrigue had existed there faded as quickly as it had been introduced into our home. The dramatic tension that once filled our evenings dissolved into distance and logistics. I did not feel vindicated by that outcome. I simply recognized that the narrative she attempted to construct had not sustained itself under scrutiny. Meanwhile, my life in Arlington developed with a steadiness that felt earned rather than reactive. The role with the defense contractor demanded focus, precision, and strategic thinking, and I found myself energized by the environment. Allison and I continued building both a professional partnership and a relationship rooted in clarity. Our conversations were direct, sometimes challenging, but never manipulative. When she needed reassurance, she articulated it plainly. When I needed space to process a decision, she respected that without framing it as rejection. There were no tests, no calculated provocations designed to measure insecurity. If something felt misaligned, we addressed it directly, rather than staging emotional scenarios to extract a reaction. Looking back, I understand that Lauren's attempt to provoke jealousy forced me to confront a truth I had quietly ignored for years. I had accepted emotional tests as normal fluctuations within marriage, believing stability alone was enough to compensate for subtle manipulation. Her strategy disrupted that illusion. By refusing to perform jealousy on command, I uncovered how fragile the foundation had become. The distance between us was not created by a third party. It was revealed by the attempt to manufacture competition. The most difficult realization was also the simplest. I deserved to be chosen without coercion or theatrics. I deserved to stand in a relationship where commitment was expressed directly rather than extracted through fear. The power shift that began that Thursday night did not occur because I competed more effectively. It occurred because I declined to compete at all. Some battles are not resolved through escalation, but through refusal. In choosing not to participate in emotional games, I reclaimed clarity about what I was willing to accept and what I was not. The silence that once unsettled Lauren became the foundation of my own certainty, and from that certainty, a different life emerged, one built not on reaction, but on deliberate alignment.